I used to think the sound of paper couldn't hurt you. But the night my father slid that thick leather-bound folder across the table, it felt like he'd pushed a blade straight through the center of my chest. He didn't warm up to it, didn't clear his throat, didn't blink, just said my brother's name, Elias, as if it were a blessing meant for him and a verdict meant for me. Elias had been home for barely a week. I had carried our family for an entire decade. My mother sat beside him, her chin lifted, her eyes soft in a way they'd never been for me. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her nod was louder than any sentence she could have formed. I didn't argue. I didn't even swallow. I just placed the power of attorney on the table beside the keys to the care center, the metal striking the wood like a closing door. Everyone thought that sound meant surrender. But it didn't. They had no idea what I'd already set in motion. The first place I ever learned to breathe was inside the corridors of Riverkeep Care. My father ran it like a kingdom, striding ahead with shoulders squared and a voice that carried through the hall. He knew every resident by name, every staff member's birthday, every inspector's preference for coffee. I was the kid trailing behind him with a clipboard, trying to push a wheelchair that weighed more than I did. The wheels rattled because my arms shook. He'd look back over his shoulder, half smiling. "Steady, Mara," he'd say. Then he'd turn back to the person he actually wanted to impress. Elias was different. He never trailed behind anyone. He breezed into rooms with that easy smile that made people lean closer without realizing they were doing it. My mother adored him. Hair brushed, shirts pressed, photos of him posed beside holiday decorations with captions like, "Our future leader." I was sometimes visible in the background of those pictures, cut off by the frame, pushing a cart of clean linens, or scrubbing a spill before anyone stepped in it. Even as children, the script had been rehearsed. Elias got summer programs, creative workshops, weekends dedicated to unlocking his potential. I got schedules pinned to the fridge, "Mara's responsible," repeated like it was my personality rather than my assignment. When Elias struggled with homework, they hired help. When I brought home awards, my father barely looked up. "That's expected," he'd murmur. Expected. The year I turned 16, my birthday cake was a grocery store rectangle left on the counter, still in the plastic box, the frosting sliding to one side. My mother kissed my forehead as she rushed out the door and reminded me not to forget my work shift that night. The shift wasn't mandatory. The mortgage was. But I didn't hate Elias back then. He wasn't the architect of any of it. He just lived inside a world that bent itself to make space for him. By the time I reached my 20s, the structure was cemented. Elias left for the city to become a designer. My parents spoke of his artistic mind, the way some people talk about prophecy. They sent him money every time he hinted at struggling. Meanwhile, my father's health slipped. My mother's too. Staff quit. State rules tightened. And when things started collapsing, they didn't call the golden child. They called me. I signed the power of attorney under fluorescent hospital lights at 2 a.m., my mother whispering, "You're good with the serious things." It wasn't gratitude. It was assignment. Confirmation that I was the scaffolding holding up a house that wasn't mine. Then, slowly, the sky shifted. Emails I usually handled were rerouted. Meetings happened without me. Documents I'd drafted for years were suddenly addressed to Elias, future development lead. One afternoon, while standing in the supply closet holding a box of wound dressings, I got a text from my mother. A photo of Elias in front of the facility sign, smiling like destiny had chosen him personally. The caption was a punch straight to the throat. Our next chapter. I walked into my parents' kitchen that evening. They didn't even turn when I entered. My father was telling Elias about strategic vision. My mother was nodding like an understudy finally seeing the real star. When they finally acknowledged me, my father waved a hand. "Mara, don't worry about the administrative stuff anymore. You've carried the heavy pieces long enough. Elias can take over the real leadership now." Real. Behind the scenes, that's what my mother called me. The phrase landed like a stone. That night, I found a folder on the table. Financial plans in Elias's messy handwriting. Wrong numbers. Impossible proposals. But both my parents had signed their initials at the bottom. They had made their choice. And so did I. I went upstairs, sat on the edge of my childhood bed, and opened a blank document. No title. No emotion. Just space. Then I wrote, 10 years of operations distilled into evidence. partnerships, compliance systems, protocols I'd built from scratch. All the things they didn't even know existed but relied on. The backbone of Riverkeep that I didn't need revenge, that I needed structure. The next morning I met with Dr. Vale, a man whose silence weighed as much as his words. He read everything slowly, his glasses slipping down his nose. When he finished, he said, "They're moving past you." I nodded. "And you're done asking to be seen?" I nodded again. He made one call, to an attorney named Ms. Linden, a woman with steady hands and a mind sharp enough to cut stone. She sat with me for hours reviewing everything I brought, laying it out piece by piece. "This," she said, tapping the operational protocols, "is intellectual property. This, tapping the licensing, is the spine of the entire system. And then, your authority is POA? Still active. Still binding." We spent a week constructing the Harborline Foundation, a non-profit structure to hold the systems, partnerships, and protections I'd built. Not for ownership, for integrity. For the residents and my parents signed advisory roles without reading the fine print, thinking they were helping me clean up files. They signed away their empire with the same casualness they used to sign my report cards. And I didn't celebrate. I just kept working. The night before their big legacy celebration, I wrote a letter to Elias. A calm one. Clear one. I explained what he was actually inheriting. The facade, not the function. The title, not the teeth. I ended it with one sentence. What you hold next depends on what you're strong enough to carry. I placed it in a red envelope that the celebration. The room sparkled like a dream someone else was having. My father proudly told the guests that Elias was ready to lead. My mother proclaimed he deserved it. I waited. And when the applause faded, I stood and placed 3 objects on the table. The keys, the old POA, and the red envelope. The sound of the keys hitting the table sliced the air. Elias opened the letter. His smile vanished. My father snatched the pages. His face drained. My mother grabbed one and read out loud, voice cracking. "This says we don't own anything." I finally spoke. "You own the buildings. That's all. The system belongs where it's safe." Ms. Linden rose from the corner of the room, calm and precise. She explained the transfers, the signatures, the oversight, the standards, the conditions. The truth. My father's voice broke. "So what do we have?" "A legacy without structure," I said. Elias sank into his seat as the reality hit him like a wave collapsing a sandcastle. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just stepped away from the table and walked out. The door clicked softly behind me, but the silence that followed was louder than any slammed door. I didn't sleep that night, not from guilt, but because the air finally felt light. The next morning I returned to Harborline. Volunteers were setting up for morning activities. Someone tuned a piano. The sun bled gently into the halls. Everything felt steady. A week later, I passed my parents in a Medicaid waiting room. They didn't see me. I didn't stop. A month after that, I saw Elias pushing a wheelchair in one of the facilities. Slow, careful, humbled. Subscribe for more.